All right, what's up, Herman & Chill students? Hey, it is so good to see you guys. I know it's kind of a one-way sight line, but maybe you're going to out for the first time. I'm Michael Jenkins, the student minister here at Herman Hills, and just on Thursdays, what we do, we kind of jump in, take a look at passages of scripture, and just unpack a couple things. Normally, when it's not, quarantine at home and things like that. Normally on Wednesday nights, we have our midweek service. And one thing we've done in kind of the new normal, so to speak, is we've kind of spread out some of our contact points. We hang out on Tuesday afternoons. And so on Thursday afternoons, we bring kind of our midweek message live on YouTube. And so thanks for hanging out with us. Thanks for watching if you are catching us after this is live. And so the past couple weeks, we've been talking about from a book of the Bible. We've been looking at an Old Testament book called Daniel. It was written by a guy named Daniel, and he was a prophet, but he was also a young man that experienced a complete change in the circumstances of his life. He grew up in what we would consider Israel today, a country in the Middle East, but his country, his homeland, got conquered by an invading army from another country. And one of the things that king did is he took leaders and even young leaders from Israel and took all of them back to the invading country. In this case, it was Babylon, which would be kind of like modern day Iraq. And so that kind of helps us frame the conversation for today, and train them to be Babylonian, train them in the language, train them in how they do things, their customs, their culture, even down to the food that they eat and things like that. And so we've looked at how 4 guys, Daniel, and then 3 guys named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they just navigated their new normal and just the change in their circumstances, the change in their life that they had no control over. And a couple weeks ago, we looked at Daniel and how he accepted some of the things that were fine. He's like, hey, look, I'll learn the language. I'll learn the culture. I'll learn how you guys do things. I'll even learn, how your government works. That's fine. I get that. I can fight against that all I want, but I'm going to accept that. But there was one thing that we read about that he did not accept, that he didn't budge on. And it was down to the food that the king asked him to eat, because it violated what Daniel believed in. And so Daniel just said, hey, I'm not going to eat those things. Can I eat something else? And in fact, I'm going to show that I'm going to be stronger when I eat what I believe the Lord has called me to eat versus what the king has, ordered for me to eat. And so one thing we talked about a couple weeks ago is, where are you going to bend? Where are you going to break? What are the things that you're going to say, I'm not going to budge on because I believe in these things. So, just deep down in my soul, like you can't convince me otherwise. There's some things like, hey, like I'll accept it. I'll roll with it. But there should be some deep-seated truths that you and I have as followers of Christ that no matter what the circumstances look like in our lives, we're not going to budge on. And so we shifted from that to then even last week. We looked at the 3 other guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they were ordered to bow down to a statue of the king. And they're like, we don't bow down to another god. And the penalty for doing that was to be thrown into a furnace that was going to be cranked up and was going to burn them alive. And the king said, look, all you have to do is give up and bow down to the idol. That's fine. It's not going to hurt anybody. And they said, look, we're not going to. We've already made that decision. That goes back to, hey, we're not budging on this. We've already made that decision. And I love what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and this is in Daniel chapter 3, they said, we're not going to do this because we believe our God could save us from the furnace. But you know what, King? Even if he doesn't, we won't bow down. And so I love that response to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they said, look, we believe God can save our lives. We totally believe that. But we know even if he doesn't, our obedience is more important than our lives. And if we were to continue to read Daniel chapter 3, which I encouraged you to do so last week, we would see that 3 people went in the furnace, but when the king ordered the fires to ramp up even hotter, when his guards looked in, they said, there's 4 people in there. There's an angel of the Lord in there that was protecting them. And There's a lot of reason to believe, based on the way that that book of Daniel was written, in the words and the way that angel of the Lord was described. There's a lot of people believe that that was an appearance of Jesus. And so that, to me, that is one of the most amazing stories. And I say stories, not in the sense of it was made up, but one of the historical events that are recorded like a story in the book of Daniel. And so we've moved from, hey, what are those things that you're not going to budge on, to a very distinct example that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we're not going to budge on this. And last week we talked about, like, hey, like, are you a person that is believing God to do big things through your life? Are you a person who's going to spend time in prayer and things like that? And so as we move, we're going to kind of close out our time in Daniel. This isn't the whole book. We're just looking at kind of a few instances about Daniel's life and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's life. And again, we're going to look at Daniel today because their normal changed. And it didn't change at their request. It didn't change because they wanted it to change. It changed without their notice, and it changed without their input. And, as we were thinking, just again, our situation, it changed without our input. There's nothing we can do about it. And so I wanted us to look at, hey, what are some people in the Bible that went through that kind of change? Theirs is different than ours, and ours is different than theirs. But from a principle standpoint, from a truth standpoint, from a, what did they do, and then what can we do? And so I would encourage you, hey, those deeply held beliefs that you and I have as followers of Christ, those are things we can't budge on, no matter what it means. And we're going to see that a little bit today. So in Daniel chapter 6, I would encourage you, if you got a Bible, flip it open, Daniel chapter 6. I'm not going to read all of it. But again, like Daniel chapter 3 last week, I would encourage you, just to read it. It will maybe take you 5 minutes to read it. And I've already been talking for 7. And so if you could hang with me, you can read Daniel chapter 6 and get a lot more than just listening to me. But in Daniel chapter 6, here's kind of what's happened. In Daniel chapter 5, actually King Nebuchadnezzar, the king that conquered Israel and took Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he was killed. Daniel chapter 5 is a kind of an interesting, kind of a creepy book, or creepy chapter in the book of Daniel. If you've ever heard the expression, the handwriting is on the wall, meaning, hey, we're seeing signs that this is over. Daniel chapter 5 is where we get that expression. There is like in a Halloween movie, there is a hand, not somebody's hand, but a hand literally writing on the wall. And the words that are translated says, it's over, basically. Like, you king, your life is going to be required. You have been found, measured, and you are done. You're going to die. And so maybe that's a fun fact, but Daniel chapter 5 is pretty interesting. I encourage you to read that one too. So on the heels of that, King Nebuchadnezzar, he died. Well, there's a new king because another army attacked them. And the king that is now in charge, that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and these guys are now following, is a guy named Darius. And so in Daniel chapter 6, we kind of meet Darius. We meet Darius, and there's one thing that some of the people that worked with Darius, that worked for Darius as a king, that they noticed about Daniel. They knew that he was an incredibly capable man in terms of, he was very smart, he was very dedicated. Daniel chapter 6 calls him faithful, and they knew, they didn't like him, but they knew that the only way they could trip him up and get him in trouble was if they do something that's connected to his relationship with the Lord. So real quick, in Daniel chapter 6, verse 5, it says this: the men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." In other words, they didn't like Daniel. They were trying to get Daniel out of leadership position because they wanted, he was kind of like the favorite, the teacher's pet, the favorite of King Darius. And they didn't like that. And they wanted him gone. But they realized, like, it's not his work ethic. It's not his skill. It's not his dedication. That we can't trip him up. The guy's like the perfect employee. We have to find something connected with the law of his God. And so they set up this arrangement with King Darius, and they said, Darius, Hey, you're the king, man. We believe you are the greatest thing ever. And we honestly think that people should start praying to you. And so we think you should set up this law that people should pray to you and you alone. And anybody that doesn't, we think you should kill them. Now, Darius is a king, and he's not a godly king. He's not somebody that worships the God of the Bible. And he's kind of like, that's not a bad idea. Let's roll with that. And so immediately, these other leaders that are just like Daniel, except they hate Daniel and they're not following the God of the Bible, they've set a trap for Daniel. Again, is Daniel going to bend? Is he going to hold onto the things that he firmly believes, or is he going to give in and maybe save his own skin? And so Daniel knew that this document had been signed, that this had become law. And Daniel, we find in Daniel chapter 6, verse 10, says this is what Daniel did. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper room, and they were open towards Jerusalem, his hometown. He got down on his knees 3 times a day, prayed, and gave thanks before his God, just as he had done previously. So here's the deal. There was a law that came into the land by his boss, King Darius, that said, if you pray to any other god, you're going to die. And Daniel said, I'm going to keep praying. I'm going to keep praying. I'm going to pray 3 times a day, just like I had done. Daniel did not give in. Daniel did not change because this law came out. Daniel did not bend on the things that he deeply held and knew to be true and right. Well, now here's the thing. Those guys that didn't like Daniel, they brought this before King Darius, and they said, Darius, here's the deal, man. We hate to bring this news to you, but guess what? Daniel's been praying to another God. He's been praying to his God. And remember that thing you signed, King Darius, that said if somebody prayed to another God that they would be thrown in the lion's den? We hate to tell you that Daniel's really done that. And so, again, their trap in their mind worked. And there's a verse in Daniel chapter 6, it's verse 14, and it talks about how this made the king sad because he liked Daniel. Daniel was like the Tom Brady of his guys. He was the Peyton Manning. He was the Michael Jordan. He was the Kobe Bryant. He was the all-star standout guy. And it was that guy to the king that broke the king's law. And so you would think the king would be mad and be like, kill him. But this showed how much Daniel meant to the king. And he's like, man, I'm kind of sad. This stinks. But he knew he had to uphold the law. And so he put Daniel in the lion's den. And again, for us, just, we might think like a zoo. This was like a pit where you would throw prisoners or criminals, and you were thrown into a pit of lions. Now, I think you and I both know what's going to wind up happening there. If you don't have any room to run and it's you and a bunch of lions, it's not going to go well for you. Like, you're not going to come out of that alive. I don't care how strong you think you are. I don't know how quick you might think you are. But if you can't run, you can't escape, and you got lions, that is not a recipe for your success. And Daniel knew that's what he was up against. But yet he didn't bend on that. He didn't break. He didn't budge. He didn't choose to save his own life and disobey the Lord. He said, I'm going to obey the Lord. Kind of like what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, like, hey, if you have to kill me, you have to kill me. My obedience and my following the Lord is more important than my own life. I think there's a huge, valuable lesson in truth for you and I today. Our lives may not be on the line. Our lives might not be at stake. But this is how deeply these guys believed and followed and trusted the Lord. They were willing to die instead of disobey God. Let me just say that again so that you and I can think through our lives. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had been changed, their normal had been changed. They've been taken from their home country. They were trained to be not Jewish leaders, but to be Babylonian and Assyrian leaders. They had been, the word for it is they've been exiled. They were never going to return to their home country. And when it came time to following the laws of the land or following the Lord, they were going to follow the Lord, even if they knew that meant their death. What about you and I and our level of commitment, our level of desire to follow the Lord when our lives are not on the line? I'll say that again, if nothing else, for my own benefit. What about our commitment and desire to follow the Lord when our lives aren't on the line? Are we willing to say no to something that we know that the Bible has called wrong, or the Bible's called us not to do, or a characteristic that the Bible's not called us to be or live out? Are we willing to say no to that and follow the Lord? Or for you and I, do our lives have to be on the line? I guess what I'm saying is, when push come to shove, are you and I going to follow the Lord? Are we going to trust him? Now, if we were to keep reading and continue on, we would see that Daniel is thrown in the lion's den, and he's thrown in there at the end of the day, and the king said, let's open it up tomorrow and see where he's there, see if he's there or not. And when the king's guards opens the lion's den that next morning, the lions are sleeping, and Daniel's there. Daniel chapter 6, it says that the Lord shut the mouths of the lions, which is an unbelievable statement. It's kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These guys followed and put their faith in the Lord, even if that meant their own death. And the Lord spared them to kind of show off who he is and make an impact on two kings. Nebuchadnezzar, again, if you read the end of Daniel chapter 3, you saw that King Nebuchadnezzar, it impacted him in a pretty profound way. Daniel chapter 6, we see that King Darius, it impacted him. I'm not saying these guys necessarily became followers of the Lord, the God of the Bible, but it made an impact on them. And this is where I kind of want us to park for a second. Again, I think a very important question for you and I to ask is, what's going to cause us to not follow the Lord? Is it going to be those enticing things, the things that are fun, the things that everybody's doing, or this desire to be cool? Or do we have a very deeply held desire as followers of Christ to follow the Lord with obedience because we love him and we care about him and we are grateful for what he's done in our lives, and he's called us to follow him? Now, I kind of thought about it this way. There's going to be times in our lives when our desire to follow the Lord is going to be tested. Just like Daniel, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're going to come across a time where we have to choose. Are we going to follow the Lord, or are we not in a situation? They could be tested by circumstances. I mean, that's where we all are right now. There may be a group of students just like you that are like, I just want to go to school. Like, I would love to sit in algebra class right now. Like, even if that meant like I had homework, I just am dying for something different than I have right now. I know maybe you're now realizing how much you actually did kind of like school, even the classes, because it gave you something to do, and it challenged you, and it gave you a chance to learn stuff. Even if you're like, I'm never going to use this, you're now maybe realizing that's better than me sitting at home all day and not being able to hang out with my friends. I would trade that today. Our circumstances have changed. Again, is that enough? Is that enough for you and I to quit following the Lord, to quit trusting him? But what about another thing? What about when our faith is tested by other people? Like Daniel in this case, it was tested by these other guys that he worked with, and then ultimately by the king. Are you going to follow what was the law of the land in that case, or are you going to follow your God? Now, that may not always be what works out for you and I. We may not have this law in our country or in our city that's going to choose us, or is going to make us choose to either follow God or follow the law of the land. But it's probably going to break down like this. It's going to be a choice between what is right and what people believe to be cool. And I know that sounds, I know I maybe sound like grandpa, putting those two things together. But if you give me the benefit of asking that question, I've lived long enough, and I was a middle schooler, and I was a high schooler, and I was a college student once upon a time. That situation hasn't changed. That situation hasn't gone away. You and I sometimes, and that's true of adults, there are times in our life where we are put in a situation where we have to choose what is right and follow the Lord, or to do what is cool. What about this? What about choosing to follow the Lord with obedience, or what just people want us to do? And that's different than being cool. That's just saying, hey, come on, man, this is the easy thing. Why not do this? Why not Hey, you want to get a good grade on that test? Why not cheat? Just, make some notes. The teacher doesn't care. The teacher doesn't check. But that's not right. That's a form of lying. That's a form of stealing. That's a form of not doing what is right. And so in those instances, are you going to do what people say we should do, or are you going to follow the Lord? And again, that might come at your own loss. You might get a lower grade, but you did it based on doing what was right. And maybe that's just a shout out to, like, maybe you should study instead of cheat. Here's another way that may break down. Are we going to do what is right, or are we going to do what is safe? Now, for Daniel, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that was a fiery furnace and that was a lion's den. But you know what? There may be instances in our life that maybe the Lord calls you and puts on your heart for you to go somewhere, go to a different country, that maybe as people look around, they're like, hey, that's not safe. And that could be, it's not safe because maybe it's a country that has been ripped apart with war, and it's just physically not safe. Maybe you're going to a place and you're going to work with people that are sick, and people might be saying, hey, if you go there, you might get sick. You might die. With coronavirus going out, I think of our medical professionals and our first responders and our people that maybe are serving, even in Nashville, that are serving like the homeless community. There might be folks that are saying, hey, that's not safe, man. Like, you might get sick. Well, it's also right for us to care for those who are hurting. And that may not be what the Lord has called every single one of us to physically do. But if the Lord is calling you to do something, to go to a country where you're not allowed to share the gospel, and if you do, you might get put in prison. Guess what? If we were scared of that, then there would be an entire country in the world that nobody would be willing to go share the gospel. And you know what? That actually kind of goes against what we read in Scripture. In Scripture, it doesn't necessarily always call us to do the safe thing. It calls us to do the thing that means we're following the Lord. If the disciples, if Matthew, Mark, Luke, Luke's not a disciple, but if Matthew, Mark, John, James, Bartholomew, Thomas, if those guys did what was safe, the gospel would have stayed in Jerusalem. But instead, every single one of those guys, except for John, every single one of those guys were killed for their faith. But the gospel spread throughout the world. And there's stories, generations after generation, there's men and women that have given their lives, not just given the duration of life, they've literally been killed for their faith, but the gospel has spread. There's going to be times where you and I are going to have to choose between doing what is right and maybe what is doing what is safe. I'm not asking you to be reckless. I'm not asking you to throw caution to the wind. I'm not asking when you go to Kroger to lick the cart handles and just say bring on the COVID-19. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there may be a few instances in our life where the choice is going to be, am I going to trust God, or am I going to do the thing that I perceive to be safe? There's a fourth thing. Am I going to do what is right, or am I going to do what is temporarily fun? And you know what, as I think about those four options, doing what is right versus what is cool or what people want me to do, or safe, or what is temporarily fun, you know what, I think that last category, is where you and I are going to probably face the most challenges. Even the Bible says sin is fun for a season. Sin is fun for a time. But you know what? Then there comes the sting of sin, the consequences from that. And we oftentimes are going to be faced with a decision to do what is right versus what might be temporarily fun. And you know what? That's still, if we make the choice to do what is temporarily fun and what is a sin, it's still a sin. I'm not saying everything that's temporarily fun is a sin, but I'm saying there's going to be things in our life that we know is wrong, that the Bible would speak against, the Bible would say that's not how Christ's followers ought to live. But you and I might step into those decisions anyways because they're fun. And we're going to trade that fun for obedience. Or we're going to trade obedience for fun. And I would encourage you, in the same way I'm challenging myself to think about this in my life, that we ought to take the tip, we ought to take the pattern, we ought to take just the same truth that we read in Daniel, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, young men whose situation changed dramatically. They had deeply held beliefs, and they were not willing to budge on them. You and I would be wise to choose what is right, to choose what God has called us to do, or more importantly, who God has called us to be, instead of choosing the things that are temporarily fun, the things that are, well, that's the safe thing, or the things that's what people want us to do, or the things that are perceived to be cool. Again, I'm not saying every cool thing, every unsafe thing, every thing that everybody wants us to do, because your doctor may want you to eat Brussels sprouts, that kind of deal, or the thing that might be temporarily fun. I'm not saying all of those things are always sinful. I'm just saying, what I'm talking about. Like if you've got friends that are just saying, hey, let's go to the party and let's get drunk, let's do a few other things that we know we ought not to do, but hey, it's going to be fun. Who cares? Are you going to choose to follow the Lord? Or are you going to choose to temporarily have some fun and then live with those consequences? Are you going to choose to cheat on that test? And maybe you get caught, maybe you don't, but you have to live knowing that score you got, that wasn't all you. That wasn't all your talent. That wasn't all your hard work paying off. That wasn't all your gift that God has given you. That was you cheating. And you might say, I'm okay getting that score. Then I would say you might want to evaluate where you stand on that. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be heavy-handed. I'm just saying if you're okay living a lie or passing off a lie as your work, you might want to investigate yourself on that. If you're willing to say no to God because it means you might not be safe, I would encourage you to read the lives of Nate Saint, of any of the disciples except John. But even though we say except John, they tried to kill him multiple times. They threw him in a vat of boiling oil, and that guy didn't die. So it's not like he came out kind of easy. I would encourage you to read those accounts of how the disciples died. History tells us that Peter was crucified upside down. I believe it was James was thrown off a roof. They were killed for what they believed in. And again, that's as far back as Jesus' day, or I could go to, many of our brothers and sisters around the world today. And we don't know their name, but they're being faced with a difficult choice, like we're going to burn your family, or you can deny the Lord. Guys, we demonstrate our love for the Lord. 1 John tells us this. We demonstrate our love for the Lord by our obedience to what the Lord has called us to do and be the people he's called us to be. So let's not trade it just for the fun thing. Let's not trade it for just always being safe. Let's not trade it for trying to be cool. Let's not trade it for just doing the things that people want us to do. Let's hunker down. Let's know what we believe, just like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But then let's also be firmly committed to those things, not willing to budge on these things, and value our commitment and our desire to follow the Lord with obedience. And then guess what? Let's start to look and see what God is going to do in and through our lives, because he values our obedience. It's not saying we obey and he does awesome things, but guess what? He's not going to do amazing things in the lives of disobedient people. That also is a truth. And so thanks for listening to me talk for a little bit today. Again, that's Daniel chapter 6. We've looked at Daniel chapter 1, Daniel chapter 3. I talked a little bit about Daniel chapter 5 today, and then we read from Daniel chapter 6 today, and that's about half of the book. Starting next month, which starts tomorrow, we're going to kind of unpack another kind of string of conversations in our midweek message. And so thanks for hanging out. We're going to be on YouTube on Thursdays at 4 o'clock. And I'm just going to remain dark because the room I'm in, it has a sensor and you can still see my face and it's kind of weird. But hey, love you guys. See you Sunday in Life Group, and we'll talk more soon. All right. Until then, we'll see you.